The city was known simply as the grid. Isolated upon a high, scrub-covered mesa, it represented the ultimate triumph of engineered order over natural chaos. It was designed and financed by the Charter, a distant, anonymous governing body obsessed with the philosophical supremacy of Euclidean law, believing that perfect geometry could mandate perfect social harmony. Every street, every block, and every interior wall was constructed according to a single, sacred mandate: the absolute building code. The code's defining feature was the 45-degree angle, not the 90-degree angle of common sense and stability, but the 45-degree angle, sharp, purposeful, and eternally recurring. Buildings were arrays of intersecting wedges, rooftops met walls at precise 45-degree slopes, and even the public seating was structured into uncomfortable, angular matrices. This geometry was deliberate. It disallowed curves, corners that encouraged loitering, and any visual or structural retreat into chaos. The theory held that if the physical environment was perfectly regulated by the 45-degree order, the minds of its inhabitants would follow suit, achieving total compliance. The governance of the grid was therefore not conducted by police, but by the inspectors, men whose sole job was monitoring the physical and social landscape for the slightest deviation from the Charter's vision. This city was a crowning achievement of the city architect. He was the man who had translated the Charter's arcane geometric philosophy into tangible brick and steel. For years, he walked the flawless streets with immense professional pride. His city was a living proof that order could be absolute, its geometry the very soul of the community. However, in the 10th year of the city's perfect existence, the pride of the architect began to curdle into cold anxiety. The structural failures began subtly, dismissed at first as minor settling or flaws in the concrete mix. They were not the sprawling, messy cracks of natural decay. They were precise, mathematically impossible incidents. The architect was called to investigate the first major dissonance in the main municipal record hall. The room, designed to anchor the city's legal order, was a perfect octagon, its supporting walls meeting the ceiling at 8 flawless 45-degree junctions. Yet, across the southeastern wall, a hairline fracture had appeared. He examined the floor with his most precise instruments. The fracture line was straight, extending exactly 2 meters. Crucially, it did not follow a seam, a material fault, or structural load point. It cut across the center of a perfectly pawed wall, defying physics. He ran stress tests on the surrounding structure. The supports were sound. The foundations were unmoving. Geologically, the mesa was granite, utterly stable. There was zero physical reason for the crack. The city architect stood in the silent, angular room, his entire professional life questioning itself. His city, his perfect geometric equation, was manifesting a catastrophic error where none should exist. It was a structural lie, driven by a fear that outweighed his professional devotion. He began a meticulous review of the city's comprehensive records. The Charter, in its obsession with compliance, documented every public interaction, every minor incident, every documented emotional shift, and correlated them with the city's continuous structural diagnostics. He cross-referenced the precise time and location of the fracture in the record hall with the social records. The physical event had occurred at 14:03 hours. He found the corresponding entry in the social log. Incident of divergence, Zone 4, 13:58 hours. A public argument had erupted outside the hall between 2 citizens over a perceived injustice in their mandated work rotation. A flash of spontaneous, unmanaged chaos. The altercation lasted precisely 4 minutes and involved shouting, an act strictly forbidden by the Social Compliance Code. The architect's hand trembled as he checked the next major structural failure, a foundational corner of the central energy plant, built on a series of intersecting 45-degree wedges, had collapsed inward at 18:15 hours. The corresponding social log entry, mass emotional outbreak at communal dining facility, Zone 7, 18:09 hours. Unregulated anger and panic following a sudden shortage of mandated food rations. The terrifying realization settled upon the city architect. The grid was a moral judge. The absolute building code was not merely structural, it was a pact. The geometry of the city was not designed to withstand natural forces. It was designed to enforce moral perfection. When the citizens introduced social chaos, when they lied, fought, or felt spontaneous emotion, the order of the 45-degree angle retaliated by fracturing itself. The city was not collapsing randomly. It was systematically punishing the breakdown of mental order with physical, targeted dissonance. His perfect architectural design was, in fact, the blueprint for terrifying geometric chaos. His life's work was a trap, and his professional quest for the source of the error was the next great act of divergence. The discovery that the grid was a punitive instrument, a machine designed to enforce psychological placidity by threatening physical collapse, sent the city architect spiraling into profound intellectual isolation. He became the most dangerous entity in the entire settlement. His mind was now filled with divergence, doubt, terror, and the singular, terrifying truth. If he revealed his findings, the resulting collective panic, the uncontrolled flood of social chaos, would instantly tear the city apart. He could no longer trust the silence. The absence of noise and argument, which he had once cherished as the sound of perfect compliance, now sounded like the strained quiet before a wire snaps. He moved through the omnipresent 45-degree angles, seeing every sharp intersection not as a pinnacle of design, but as a geometric threat. He meticulously erased his tracks, deleting the correlation data that linked the dissonance, structural failures, to the social logs. He knew that the inspectors, men whose authority rested entirely on the belief that geometry was immutable, would never accept a moral explanation for a physical fault. For them, order was the only reality. The architect realized the physical error was merely the symptom. The chaos lay in the original design philosophy. He needed to find the source code of the city, which could only reside within the original charter of construction, the foundational, philosophical document that dictated the absolute building code. These documents were stored within the central archives, a fortress of geometric order placed at the literal center of the grid. The archives were guarded by complex, redundant security systems designed to measure and repel any physical or electronic deviation. Access required authentication from 3 separate high-ranking officials of the Charter, a bureaucratic obstacle designed to protect the lie of the Foundation. Knowing that official access was impossible, the architect devised a plan based on the principles of necessary flaw he had learned from the failures he had studied. He spent 2 days calculating a temporary, localized error in the archive's environmental control system, a system designed for absolute compliance to temperature and humidity. He manipulated the inputs to induce a minor, precisely timed divergence in the temperature regulation, creating a fluctuation just outside the mandated tolerance. The alarm was instantaneous but brief. When the inspectors scrambled to correct the physical error, the architect slipped into the archives, moving with the unnatural speed and focus of a man possessed by a greater, geometric purpose. He found the ancient charter document, bound in heavy, angular covers. The text was not technical specifications, but high-flown philosophical decree, authored by the grand geometrician, the unseen founder of the entire experiment. The architect scanned the dense, unsettling prose until he found the section detailing the rationale for the 45-degree angle. The angle of 45 degrees is the perfect expression of reliance. By its nature, it can never stand alone. It demands a co-equal, opposite force for stability. We shall make the structural perfection of this city reliant upon the compliance of its souls. When order is breached by chaos, the angle will seek its natural correction, dissonance, thus proving that societal deviation is physical sin. The terrible truth was confirmed. The city was a psychological weapon. The 45-degree dissonance was not an accident. It was the chaos built into the foundation. The architect found a chilling, subsequent warning that seized his breath, the potential for a triple 45 event. This catastrophic scenario was defined as a simultaneous, geometrically linked failure of 3 primary support structures. If 3 independent structural failures occurred within the span of 1 solar cycle, the resulting geometric instability would break the city's central anchoring system, turning the entire grid into an unstable field of razor-sharp angles, an intentional, irreversible act of absolute chaos. He looked at the current social log and saw the danger. 3 separate minor outbursts had already occurred in the last 12 hours. The settlement was on the brink of the Triple 45 event. Just as he was about to copy the crucial section of the charter, a sudden, cold sense of being watched froze him. He quickly sealed the documents and slipped out of the archives. Waiting outside, near the perfectly orthogonal street corner, stood the chief inspector. The inspector was motionless, his posture perfect, his face devoid of emotion. He said nothing about the breach of security or the temperature fluctuation. He merely observed the architect with an unnerving, perfect scrutiny. "You have been measuring the wrong angles, architect," the chief inspector stated, his voice a flat, synthesized monotone. "You look for flaws in the stone, when you should be ensuring the perfection of the compliance." The architect knew the inspector sensed his intellectual divergence, a crime far greater than accessing forbidden texts. The time for subtle investigation was over. To save the city, he had to stop the social chaos long enough to introduce a permanent, stabilizing era, a geometric lie that would grant the city structural independence from the impossible demands of moral perfection. The Triple 45 event was imminent, and the only path to safety was an act of profound geometric treason. The scrutiny in the chief inspector's eyes was absolute. It was not the suspicion of an officer, but the geometric certainty of a machine detecting a fatal input error. The city architect knew that any continued pretense of compliance was pointless. The divergence was visible in the frantic, necessary chaos of his own thoughts. He did not argue or confess. Instead, he used the city's rigid order against itself. He bowed with mandated precision, a final act of compliance, and then turned the corner with a speed that slightly exceeded the mandated walking pace. The small, mathematically insignificant error in his motion was enough to confuse the inspector's immediate tracking grid. The architect fled toward his private workshop, a small, triangular space dedicated to calculation. The city was a living countdown to the Triple 45 event, and he was the only mind capable of rewriting the code. He had to introduce a geometric lie that would override the truth of the charter, a necessary flaw that would stabilize the structure regardless of the populace's inevitable social chaos. His calculations were frantic, a blur of lines and equations across his drawing board. The 45-degree angle required an equal counterpart to maintain its balance. Since the counterpart, the citizen's perfect compliance, was unattainable, the angle itself must be altered. He determined that the flaw could not be small, like the minute 0.17-degree warp of the previous crisis. It had to be a significant, philosophical shift. To permanently sever the structural integrity from the impossible burden of moral perfection, he calculated the necessary shift, the most stable angle adjacent to 45 degrees, yet distinct enough to break the Kers's geometric logic. He chose 46 degrees. The next step was implementation. The dissonance was enforced via the city's structural monitoring system, which was anchored at the central nexus. This nexus was a massive, subterranean hub where every utility line, power, water, communication, and, most critically, the structural diagnostic feedback, converged. The nexus was a geometric marvel, a dense knot of converging 45-degree conduits designed to optimize energy flow based on the principle of geometric purity. If he could corrupt the angle of a major utility conduit leading from the nexus, the resulting feedback loop would introduce the 46-degree flaw into the entire structural monitoring system. The city would start reporting 46-degree order as the new stable truth, breaking the punitive 45-degree curse. As the architect gathered the specialized tools needed, a hydraulic jack, shims made of non-conductive ceramic, and precision measuring devices, the city logged its second incident of divergence. 2 children, frightened by the deepening silence, ran unsupervised through the main square. Social chaos was accelerating. The Triple 45 event was now terrifyingly close. The pursuit began almost immediately. The chief inspector, utilizing the city's perfect, predictable geometric layout, sealed off the 2 main thoroughfares leading to the nexus. The architect was forced to move through the narrow, angled service paths designed for maintenance, not for escape. He heard the heavy, rhythmic steps of the inspectors behind him, their pursuit a synchronized pulse of absolute compliance. He reached a triangular service yard, its three walls meeting at perfect 45, and 90 degrees. He paused, watching their approach. He used his knowledge of the city's blind spots, the single-minute error in the planning that allowed utility access without line of sight, to slip into a maintenance hatch just before the inspector's perfectly synchronized arrival. He descended into the cool, humming darkness of the Nexus. The subterranean hub was terrifyingly beautiful. Conduits and pipes ran everywhere, all meeting at clean, sharp 45-degree joints, forming a dense, crystalline network of infrastructure. The air hummed with the energy of perfect order. He identified the primary power trunk conduit, a thick metal tube that ran directly beneath the central archives. This was the core vein of the city's geometric heart. Working against the clock, fueled by the panic he knew was escalating above ground. The third divergence was logged while he was underground, an argument over water rationing near the main reservoir. The architect calculated his insertion point. He positioned the hydraulic jack to exert pressure on the conduit, just enough to bend the massive pipe without snapping the seals. The goal was to introduce the era into the structural matrix itself. With immense effort, the metal groaned. He inserted the ceramic shims at the joint, applying precise counterpressure to hold a new angle. He used his precision protractor to measure the change. He ignored the pain in his arms, focusing only on the bright digital readout of the angle. 45.1 degrees. 45.5 degrees. Finally, the measurement stabilized. 46.00 degrees. The effect was instantaneous and silent. No explosions, no alarms. But the entire Nexus hummed with a different frequency, a subtle dissonance that pulsed outward through the structural monitoring systems. The city was now being told that 46 degrees was the new definition of order. The architect had severed the toxic link between the city's geometry and its people's flawed morality. He had committed the ultimate act of geometric treason. He had saved the city, but by guaranteeing that he would be the single most hunted man in the entire grid. The moment the 46-degree flaw was introduced into the central nexus, the city entered a state of terrifying, paradoxical stability. The city architect emerged from the maintenance hatch into the growing light of the morning, expecting to hear the catastrophic groan of the triple 45 event, the simultaneous fracture of the three primary structural anchors. But the groan never came. Above ground, the social chaos continued to escalate. The third recorded divergence, the argument over rations, had fully metastasized into widespread panic. Citizens, their mental order entirely broken by the accumulation of suppressed emotion and the knowledge that something was fundamentally wrong, were running aimlessly through the sharp, angled streets. They shouted, they cried, and they displayed every form of unsynchronized, unmeasured chaos that the Charter had forbidden. Yet, the buildings held. The rigid structures of the planned city, the intersecting 45-degree wedges, stood firm against the massive, unprecedented surge of emotional deviation. The punitive link was severed. The city's geometry, now anchored to the 46-degree floor, was structurally satisfied. It no longer required the impossible purity of human compliance to maintain its form. The architect watched the chaos with detached relief. He had successfully saved the physical city by destroying the citizen's psychological foundation. He had protected the stone by accepting the frailty of the mind. Meanwhile, the chief inspector and his few remaining loyal overseers were in a state of controlled, burning fury. They had observed the social collapse, expecting the necessary geometric retribution. When the structural alarms remained silent and the seismic monitors showed nothing but granite stability, they realized the order had been hijacked. The chief inspector immediately initiated a complete system audit, utilizing the remaining diagnostic networks. His investigation was terrifyingly swift and precise, tracing the anomaly backward from the city's overall structural reports, past the localized monitoring stations, and directly to the central nexus. They found the evidence of the geometric treason instantly. The hydraulic jack marks, the disturbed dust, and the subtle, telltale misalignment of the primary power conduit. The chief inspector, standing before the conduit joint, stared at the ceramic shims holding the pipe at an unnatural tilt. He brought his precision protractor to the joint, his hand steady despite the existential trauma the reading inflicted. The readout confirmed the horror, 46 degrees. The single degree, the chief inspector whispered, his voice resonating with pure, intellectual agony. He introduced the most unnecessary, unjustifiable error. He chose dissonance over order. The overseers, conditioned their entire lives to worship the 45-degree angle as the truth, stood paralyzed by the violation. The chief inspector, however, retained his terrifying capacity for order. He did not break, he adapted. He realized that the architect was not merely a vandal. He was a philosophical revolutionary who had attacked the very definition of their reality. The chief inspector's immediate response was not to fix the pipe, but to initiate a total lockdown of the grid. All exit routes were sealed, and the remaining inspectors were ordered to follow the grid system backward from the central nexus, calculating the architect's most probable escape vectors. The pursuit was transformed into a geometric equation. They knew the architect was flawed, but they still relied on the fundamental order of the city layout to trap him. The geologist, now the most hunted man in his own creation, knew he was trapped. He could not reverse the flaw, nor could he survive the inevitable attempt by the chief inspector to restore the 45-degree absolute. He retrieved the crucial pages from the original charter he had copied, the text detailing the philosophy of the 45-degree dissonance and the fatal dependence on moral perfection. He realized that the necessary flaw was only half the solution. To make his error permanent, to prevent the overseers from simply restoring the 45-degree angle and re-establishing the curves, he had to destroy the document that defined the city's original purpose. He had to eradicate the source code of the lie. The final act of treason against geometry would not be structural, but documentary. He had to ensure that future generations only knew the city as it now was, the stable, flawed, 46-degree reality. He began his final, methodical journey toward the Central Archives, ready to sacrifice the historical order for the future chaos of survival. The city architect's movements were dictated by inverse geometry, while the chief inspector and his overseers pursued him along the city's major, perfectly aligned pathways, relying on the efficiency of the 90-degree street grid. The architect moved exclusively through the triangular service yards and the narrow, irregular interstices between buildings. These spaces, considered geometrically inefficient and therefore largely ignored by the rigid surveillance systems, became his sanctuary of chaos. The hunt was relentless. The chief inspector, driven by a primal need to restore the numerical purity of the 45-degree absolute, had locked down the entire grid. Every minute of the pursuit was logged, the data processed instantly to predict the architect's movement based on the logical efficiency of order. But the architect was no longer obeying logic. He was obeying the dictates of the flaw. He finally reached the Central Archives. This massive, octagonal building, the geometric heart of the city, was now the final battlefield. He slipped inside, finding the vast, silent halls empty, save for the presence of the chief inspector himself. The inspector stood guard over the single steel vault containing the original charter. He held no weapon, only a small, highly polished protractor, the symbol of his unwavering belief in the measurement of order. "You came here to destroy the truth," the chief inspector stated, his voice hollowed by the absolute nature of his conviction. "You came to erase the absolute building code and leave us with nothing but your arbitrary, irrational error." "I came here to destroy the lie," the architect corrected, stepping fully into the light, placing his own precision instruments, now tools of treason, on a nearby pedestal. The charter mandates an unattainable moral perfection. It demanded the suppression of human emotion to maintain structural integrity. This city was not a home, it was a geometric prison. The architect pointed to the walls. "Look around you, Inspector. The people above are screaming, fighting, and descending into pure social chaos. Yet, the ceiling remains secure. The walls remain uncracked. Your 45 event failed. He laid out the pages of the corrupted monitoring reports. The city is stable because I introduced the 46-degree flaw. The new order now accepts the necessary dissonance inherent in human nature. To restore your 45-degree lie now would cause true, unpredictable chaos, the kind that the earth, unappeased by an honest flaw, would violently manifest. The chief inspector stared at the corrupted data, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence of his senses, the city's stability, with the truth of his faith, the sanctity of the 45-degree angle. He was trapped in the paradox of the necessary flaw. The architect had not just corrupted the structure, he had corrupted the very proof of its stability. The 46-degree flaw is a mathematical sin. The inspector screamed, his composure finally fracturing. It is an admission of failure. We sought perfection. Perfection is the chaos. The architect retorted. The 46-degree flaw is the only acknowledgement that grants survival. It is the geometric measure of human frailty, the single degree of tolerance the city required to breathe. As the chief inspector stood paralyzed, his belief system collapsing in on itself, much like the hyperbolic spiral of the previous tower, the architect moved to the vault. He unlocked it quickly, using a key mechanism he himself had designed, a final bitter irony of order turning against its creator. He lifted the heavy original charter, the philosophical cornerstone of the city's chaos. The document was dense with the intricate geometric proofs that justified the city's punitive design. The architect did not hesitate. He used a flask of highly corrosive solvent, originally intended for cleaning precision instruments, and poured it over the ancient parchment. The ink dissolved into a meaningless, black residue, and the intricate geometric diagrams that formed the source code of the lie curled, smoked, and turned to ash. The physical act of destroying the charter was a final, absolute geometric reset. The 46-degree flaw was no longer merely a physical alteration. It was now the unwritten, undeniable foundational truth of the grid. There was no longer any original order to restore. The chief inspector watched the parchment burn, and the remnants of his order left him. He collapsed into a fetal position, sobbing, his rigid mind unable to cope with the absolute eradication of its purpose. The city architect, the savior through treason, stood alone in the archives, breathing the smoke of the destroyed lie. His mission was complete, but his identity was forfeit. He could not remain in the city he had saved. He was a living proof of its permanent error. He was now an exile, destined to carry the burden of the necessary flaw into the wider, messy world. The city architect emerged from the central archives carrying nothing but the heavy knowledge of his geometric treason. He left behind the crumpled figure of the chief inspector, a man whose life had imploded alongside the original charter, his rigid mind unable to survive the destruction of the 45-degree absolute. The architect did not look back at the central nexus. His focus was forward, toward the jagged, scrub-covered horizon beyond the city limits. He moved through the streets of the grid, which, though structurally sound, were now unrecognizable in their psychological ruin. The inhabitants were still in the throes of their collective, unmanaged chaos. They were physically safe, saved by the 46-degree flaw, but they were free only in the messy, painful sense of existential despair. The architect knew the city he had built, and then saved, was lost to him forever. He had sacrificed a vision of perfect order to purchase the reality of flawed, messy survival. He escaped the city using the very last, most subtle of his planned errors, a drainage culvert designed with a necessary, slight deflection from the grid to allow for natural runoff, a feature the charter had grudgingly permitted but never recorded in the central schematics. He slipped into the wilderness, the sharp, relentless angles of the planned city receding behind him. The fate of the grid in the following years was sealed by the destruction of its philosophical foundation. The inspectors, leaderless and faced with the incontrovertible stability of a 46-degree reality, failed utterly to restore order. They could not rebuild the lie because the source code was gone, and the city's structure itself broadcasted the counter-truth. The city slowly adapted, its initial chaos giving way to a permanent, dull malaise. The 45-degree angle remained the dominant motif, but the structures subtly sagged, leaned, and shifted to accommodate the 46-degree floor embedded in the nexus. The city became a strange, geometrically unique space, stable, but forever slightly wrong. It was a monument to the fact that when forced to choose between perfect order and survival, the structure chose the latter. The geologist adopted the life of an exile, shedding his identity and his profession. He became the custodian of the necessary flaw. He traveled the expanding world, dedicating his life to introducing tiny, stabilizing errors into any system or structure he encountered that exhibited the telltale rigidity of absolute compliance. He sought out places where contracts demanded impossible perfection, where architecture stifled the human spirit, or where geometry was used as a tool of repression. His interventions were always minute, a few millimeters of unrecorded slack in a tension cable, an intentional redundancy in a logic gate, or a single clause in a legal document that introduced chaos as a valid contingency. His actions ensured survival. He taught the world, one structure at a time, that true stability is not found in the pursuit of the absolute, but in the deliberate acknowledgement of imperfection. In the distant future, centuries later, the grid stands as an architectural curiosity. Scholars marvel at its structural longevity, attributing its stability to a supposed advanced, unrecorded structural principle. The 46-degree floor is mistaken for a brilliant, unique design feature. The story of the social chaos that the city imposed upon its people is forgotten, eclipsed by the physical reality of its permanent, flawed survival. The city never collapsed, not into a terrifying triple 45 event, nor into random rubble. It simply endured, a unique, tilted monument to the final acknowledgement of imperfection. The city architect had broken the geometric curse, not by finding the perfect solution, but by engineering the perfect, most necessary error. He proved that the price of perfection is annihilation, but the reward of honesty is permanent, if slightly crooked. Order. Warning: this video contains purely fictional supernatural horror content. The events, characters, and concepts depicted are products of imagination and are not intended to promote, endorse, or normalize any harmful or illegal activities, including child abuse, sexualization, or self-harm.